Welcome to the More in Common podcast. We all know how hard it can be to handle conflict and disagreements, especially when it comes to politics. These moments can strain even our closest relationships, and that's why we're here. I'm Keith Richardson, and for over 5 years, we at More in Common have worked with professionals from all walks of life, NFL teams, tech companies, and community leaders, ultimately to improve how people connect and communicate. And with my background in psychology, I've spent 20 years refining strategies that focus on compassion and understanding. And I'm joined by my co-host, Gerren, who joined the team 2 years ago. Gerren is a producer, an entrepreneur, and a creative, and he lives the principles we talk about, bringing real-world experience to every episode. Together, we're here to help you discover how we all have more in common than we might think. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back, y'all, to More in Common podcast, the podcast where conversations spark connections and connections build community.
I'm Gerren alongside my man, Mr. We dive deep into human experience, challenging assumptions, and building understanding.
From the workplace to personal growth and everything in between, we bring you real stories and bold ideas that aim to bridge divides and create thriving connections.
Because when we embrace our differences, listen and connect, we'll find that we have more in common.
Yes. And today, the cat sweatshirt's back, as we talked about last time, because we're recording on the same day. And then my cat is making an appearance in the background.
Yes,
if you
cat
can't
cameo.
see that. So it's all cats all day today.
What's your cat's name?
That's Toro.
Okay.
It's a big, loud, deaf cat who is 16 and a half years old and likes to wake us up several times a night. It's
right
fun.
on, Toro. Make yourself
right on,
known.
Toro. Hey, look, I want to kick this one off. I want to ask you a question that I've started asking people recently.
Okay.
Why do you guarantee like to talk about politics?
Woof. Deep question, huh? Well, I think that politics fundamentally affects our lives, right? Part of this is being Black American. There was a time where my whole existence was illegal, right?
True.
There was a time where the laws of the land, the politics of the land defined how I could or could not interact with the space around me. That still has some impact on the way we live our lives today. Those things aren't necessarily already done with. They have residual impacts that are still being lived by people who are here, even though those laws may have been taken off the books. But I also feel like it is a way to discuss some of the larger issues about being a human being, about what we value, what we find important, where we spend our money, our collective money as a society. So I think that I discuss politics with people not only to understand where they're coming from, but to try to create a future, create a world that I want to live in.
With that second part, to try to create a world, what is that? Does that mean you're trying to persuade them? Does that mean you're trying to convince them of something? Like what does that look like? What does that mean?
Yeah, it does. It means exactly that. It means trying to persuade. For instance, I'm not a believer that the amount of money America spends on war, either its own wars or propagating other wars around the world, is necessarily the best way to spend our money when we know that there are things that we could do to make everybody's everyday life easier. Like, why do we have so many homeless people if we're sending so many billions to other countries to blow up stuff? That seems like a bit of a disconnect between how I want the world I live in to exist, right? So, like, why are we as a collective spending so much money for more death as opposed to trying to help the people who need to eat on a day-to-day basis? Like, that seems like, I don't know, like maybe we should weigh our priorities a little bit different. And I get that not everybody agrees. Some people believe that societal security, the country's security is paramount to all that. And some other people in a more cynical view feel like the folks who are suffering because of their own accord. And therefore the charity of helping them out doesn't actually go as far as some would think. But I'm willing to have that discussion with all comers, so to speak. And I think that's part of why I do talk about politics, probably more often than some people would say you should. I'm not one of those people who believes that like a bar is not a place to have those conversations, because this country was founded by semi-drunk people talking in bars about what they wanted their country to be, separate from how they experienced England, right? Like, if there wasn't these public houses, pubs, at the time of the American Revolution, like, would the Declaration of Independence contain some of the things that it contains, some of the thoughts that it contains? Were literally from people having these debates with a beer in hand. You know what I mean? Like,
so that's a really interesting conclusion. That's kind of drawing into the quick follow-up question. When talking to regular folk whose primary influence is in the voting booth, or maybe an email that they can send to a politician, or whatever the case may be, what do you hope the conclusion of a conversation like that leads to?
Great question. I don't believe in easy fixes. You know, to me, I kind of consider these things like sales. Like, there are various touch points along a sales cycle before a person decides they're going to buy from you. Yeah. And I believe that there are various touch points in a person's life before they can reevaluate or change their mind about what they think. I mean, you often tell the story of you and Rodney and the Colin Kaepernick situation, and how when that started, you guys were kind of in separate viewpoints about what was happening there, and that your conversations about it helped you change how you felt about it. But I don't think it happened in just that one point. I believe that along your lifespan, even if you weren't critically aware of it or not, there were several touch points that allowed you to be open to viewing the situation in the same way or similarly, or even listening to Rodney in a way that you may not have listened to somebody else. And that includes the touch points of your friendship, of your closeness with him. And I believe that the same is true for everybody, right? In my lifetime, I've seen the discussion about openness of homosexuality completely change, right? Yeah. When I was a teenager, it was like, an openly gay politician? What? And now there's, you know, possibly Pete Buttigieg running for president, right? He's got a cabinet position. There's openly trans people in Congress now. And that's from touch points. That's from people having open experiences and having conversations with their family members who are gay, seeing their friends who are gay come out, or understanding their struggle. And it takes time. It also sometimes takes us collectively saying, hey, I saw this story about a gay man getting dragged behind a truck, and like, that shouldn't happen to anybody. Right? Like, that touches your humanity. It makes people go, you know what, that's a bridge too far. And it makes people reflect upon what about our society allows that to happen. What about our society allows us to get to that point? And that is, to me, the beauty of these conversations, right, is that sometimes it may not be as fast as we want it, but I hope, as Martin Luther King once said, that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, for the, maybe not when you want it, but eventually.
Maybe not in your lifetime.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I guess, when you have a conversation, do you take that careful intention in mind, or does it depend on who you're talking to?
I almost always try to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not easy.
No.
As I mentioned in a previous episode, I feel like I used to be the person that was more quick to cut people off. And that wouldn't be without trying. It would be with, after a couple of statements that I would try to craft articulately my position whilst respecting theirs, but not feeling, any sort of receptiveness to it, then go, you know what, fine. Go deal with your bigotry over there. So I think that it's a work in progress, as most things. I do focus on that. I try to make that a reality. Do I fall short sometimes? Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I appreciate your acknowledgement of that, because that's a core element, right, of all things. Like, I'd love to be consistent in everything I do, but shit, just some days I'm just not the same person
I don't got all that.
I was
I check in
yesterday.
with
I don't
myself
have
and
meet myself where I am. I appreciate that honest and thorough answer. I think I asked that question, and I wanted to start this conversation off where, at the time this is released, in the start of a new administration, we're at a cultural point, that is, to your point, touch points over time. We are at a point where we don't do well accepting other people's viewpoints. And I don't mean accepting hateful rhetoric or bigotry or anything like that, but, understanding that might be where someone is, and trying to figure out where you want to go with that. But we've generations now of, you don't talk about two things at the dinner table, is politics and religion. And those are, to your point, very important topics of conversation that influence our lives on a daily basis. And, coming back to our last episode about shame and guilt, we're so inconsistent around our expectations of these conversations that it makes it wildly difficult. And let's think about the whole purpose of this podcast in general is to provide tools, tips, and bold ideas on how we can get better at that, so we can build stronger connections, especially when we disagree, because if we don't, we won't get the outcome that you seek to gain when you are having these conversations. And that is a common way forward. We might not agree on the outcome or the way of going about doing it, but we can get to a place where we have a sense of shared macro cultural values that we can agree on more, right? Like, the idea that I can't even fathom an American election that has more than 60% of a population voting for a particular candidate versus another.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, everything's so close now. Everything's so state dependent. Everything is all ideological, and everybody's in their echo chamber. And navigating politics is a core element to all that we're talking about, though all that we're talking about applies to anything. And I think it really comes down to this very question, like asking to the audience, do you know why you like talking about politics? I've asked this several times of late, and I'm going to continue to do a certain survey poll as I look to implement some of the strategies that we teach, like the first episode of this reboot, when we talk about setting expectations for the conversation itself. Well, what are your own expectations for actually having it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is it your expectation that you're going to change someone's mind? Well, then are you talking to someone who has that same expectation and they're going to change your mind? And are you going to change your mind? Or are you having a false expectation in the conversation? What I'm finding is that a lot of the times these conversations come up is just a matter of social sorting. Like, I'm having it so I know who my people are, which only perpetuates the division. It doesn't actually bring us closer together to be able to have these conversations in a more meaningful and intentional way.
And to your point, people feel comfortable or safe having those conversations, safer having those conversations with people that they perceive to already be aligned with them.
Right.
But it's very difficult to find the correct opportunity to have that discussion with someone who's not already aligned with you in a safe way, in a way that you feel like you're not going to be attacked, in a way where you guys have enough overlap to even be interested in hearing the other person completely out, which I think happens a lot. I find that there are some folks that will feign this level of interest, but in reality, they're really just waiting for their opportunity to tell you why you're wrong about it.
Right. And that is not helpful to the broader goal. And then I think about the other side of that, the danger in that I know I've succumbed to, because we're social beings, right? And we're sorting ourselves and we're trying to simplify for collective survival. And there are times where it's like, oh, I will oblige to that line of thinking without really critically going in then I'm going to use, I don't want this to be a conversation necessarily about politics for today. Like, I really want to anchor on this idea, but I'm going to use an example of something that I've been reflecting on of late is Joe Biden, right? Like, let's talk about the journey of Joe Biden, who said he was going to be a one-term president. Had he followed through with that, the last 4 years would have been leading towards a transition to an open primary where there would be candidates up for election to then take the helm going forward, or at least run taking the helm going forward. Instead, for his own personal and human experience, which I completely understand just as a human, why that's really hard for a career politician to finally admit that it's the end. He waited till it was too late. Then they were backed into a corner. And then there are a lot of people out there who think that the Democratic Party is violating democratic principles by anointing another candidate yet again, like they did in 2016. And that as a result of that, there's resistance to even considering a candidate from that party if, they were going to honestly consider it to begin with. And so you watch this journey. Now, during the last 4 years, Fox News has been screaming from the hilltop that everything's not all right with Joe Biden. Now, the way they go about doing it creates resistance for someone like me who's like, oh, they're just poking holes, right? Like, now I am falling, we'll say victim to a cognitive bias that says, okay, you lied before or you told false truths, that now I'm just not going to listen to what you're saying because you're just trying to make it hard for this president. Well, it turns out they weren't wrong, right? And we're not navigating this conversation as a society to sit there and go, wait a second, should we be lobbying our politicians to be like, no, you need to make sure he's a one-term president. Instead, it's let's all stand behind Joe Biden and prop him up and say great things about him, rather than honestly looking at the situation, not in a mean way. We don't have to be mean about honest criticism. We don't have to be mean about honest reflection to then look at it and go, I don't like what they're saying because of how they're saying it, but what they're saying has some credibility, and we should probably look at this a little bit more closely and have more meaningful conversations so we can move forward in a more productive way than the way that it ultimately played out.
There's definitely some very interesting points to examine about how that was all waged. For instance, I wholeheartedly agree that part of the major problem that Kamala faced was there wasn't the time for her to ingratiate herself within the subgroups of the Democratic Party writ large, based upon the fact that there wasn't a run up to this. There wasn't a time for these ideas to be tested. There wasn't a time for them to even be communicated in a way where folks could be like, yeah, that I identify with that. That's where I want to see this party going, right? An open primary would have had more of that debate, would have had more of that time, would have had more people in it to represent different forms of ideas. And I feel like part of what they tried to do to alleviate that problem was find the Cheneys, right? Find these disaffected Republicans who they could put into the fold, plug in, and hope that that would be enough to push them across. But obviously no, because they lost so much of the base of the Democratic Party by even selecting that, right? So it was this patchwork, so to speak, a patchwork coalition that really wasn't founded upon anything that folks really agreed upon, right? These sort of marriages of convenience, political marriages of convenience that didn't actually pan out to do anything because, to your point, Fox News had already spent 4 years, dismantling that and creating other links, other connections for their side of the aisle that would supersede any sort of patchwork that was going to happen in the last 2 months, 4 weeks, 6 weeks up to the election, right? Like you can't do it in that time frame.
You can't. And it speaks to what you said at first, right? It's the small drips over time that have a more lasting impact than the immediate, like the woman on the bus that pointed to me and said I should be ashamed of myself. She didn't flip me in that moment. It took me a patchwork of reflection over the course of a couple of weeks to get to the conclusion that she was ultimately right. And like, this is, kind of why I've been thinking about this a lot lately, is because I fell victim to that as well. And I hate to use the word victim because this is just our human behavior. We have a lot to process. We have a lot going on in our lives, and we fall into a line of thinking sometimes that might actually be counterproductive to the direction that we even want our lives to go. And by honestly engaging in political conversation with people you agree with as well, right? Like actually honestly inspecting things that we think in these ideas and understanding the counterpoints to those ideas to understand, like, okay, what does this actually mean for us, does also require that we engage with people who have counterpoints. And what we're actually doing now is we're really just self-sorting, in part because we don't have a purpose. Going back to the purpose of this episode is not to unpack, I'm by no means I'm a political junkie at times, but we're not here to unpack the political woes of the Democratic Party. It's really just to understand, like, we all kind of help those things happen by not having these conversations, but more so because we don't actually understand why we are having these conversations. We do it when it comes up, and then it might go the way we want it to go, or we might go the way we don't want it to go. And those two directions tend to be, oh, I'm talking to someone that I agree with, or I'm talking to someone I don't agree with. And don't get me wrong, there is true safety. Like, this is all about social safety and survival again, right? Like, especially if you are a subjugated group in some way, you feel the threat. The queer community is a great example of this today. Like, you don't want to be engaged with someone who you actually feel threatened by. Like, that's not safe. And you need to sort that. You need to make sure, because there's a lot of vitriol and hate towards the queer community, especially trans individuals these days. And so there's utility in that psychology, but en masse, on the whole, like, if we don't approach a conversation with intention that we understand, not that we've communicated, not that we've said, okay, what are we trying to accomplish in this conversation? We've talked about that before, but like truly understanding why I want to engage in this conversation. Maybe it is to sort, but understanding like there's a downfall to that sorting. But if we can get to a place where it's admitting like, yes, I do want to engage in a conversation so I can change someone's mind, can really help inform how you go about doing that, because you know that's your purpose and intention. It can also be a way of just recognizing in yourself that maybe that isn't the best approach most of the time, is to change someone's mind. It's more to come to a common space of agreement, right? Like, where do we have overlap so that if we look at each other, let's say there's a presidential election coming up. Obviously, this one's passed. We know where we are. We can sit here and honestly say, so who are you voting for? And then they can ask you, and you both say different answers. You can then further inspect that conversation to say, okay, we just talked about this as a value that we both see as important to where we're going as a country. I don't see your candidate espousing that value. Like, help me understand how, like, what it is about that candidate that espouses that value for you. And then you can honestly, and in an ideal world, and this isn't going to work 100% of the time, and you can't expect it to, but where you're having these ancillary conversations in those circumstances, maybe, just maybe, you both end up agreeing to vote for the same person. But guess what? Now, if two people are voting for the same person instead of each voting for a separate individual, you're moving a broader needle to having more people end up voting for that person, because no one's ever going to win 100% of the electorate, right? No one's ever going to win, but maybe we can get to a place where a presidential candidate could win 60+% of the popular vote again, like it has happened in the past, because of that commonality that we're seeking in our individual engagements, based on the fact that we understand why we're having the conversation versus just taking it and then running away from it, which is pretty much probably what most people do, is run away from it.
A couple of things that definitely strike me there is that, one, we can't see the space of political debate to cable news, right? Cable news, both sides, their job is to get eyeballs, to be as divisive as possible in some ways, because it's that drama that makes you want to tune in. But that's not actually what we do in real life when we're across the table from each other, right? Like, even those folks on TV don't actually hate each other like that. They go out for drinks after the show. Like, our members of Congress, like, have pet names for each other. Like, let's be real about it. There's a lot of theater in what we receive because of how the world works today. But when we see the space to that theater, it creates this unnecessary drama between folks. And it touches back onto what we were talking about in the last episode. Like, if your point in having this conversation is just to shame somebody else out of their point of view, even when they never agreed with you to begin with, like, that's probably not going to work out for you, right? Like, it's probably your shame tool here isn't going to work out, because they're not affected by your judgment. They were never trying to be part of your group to begin with. And so if you shame them out of their group, they're like, yeah, that's exactly why I'm over here. You're proving my point to me right here. And so if we really want to make those connections, it is about meeting people where they're at, being willing to listen, approaching this with empathy, approaching these conversations with the things that we are talking about on this show. And the reason why I think this show is important, to help just take some of the, like, fire out of these things for a little while. And so that we can find our commonalities as opposed to just highlighting our differences.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of these things too, like, by knowing why you want to talk about politics. Like, one of the things for me that I enjoy talking about politics is I get to learn how other people think about these issues. Because what I do know is that I don't know everything. In fact, I know a very small amount of things that are just based on my desires and emotional experiences and all of the things that we have talked about already on this show. And, talking to people who have differing perspectives, I get to learn. I get to understand. I get to see what else might be informing someone else's point of view so that it can influence the way I think. And it could influence the way I vote in the same way that I hope to influence the way that they vote, right? I want to be in a conversation, and I think this is why it matters, asking people why they like to talk about politics. Because one of the things that's so critically important, and we've talked about this, is it's not just about my ability to hear what they have to say. I want to be in a conversation where they're actually internalizing what I'm saying too, right? And that we're having a common exchange of ideas that looks at two sides of the coin and recognize what the value of the coin is, not just the value of their side, right? And it's in that understanding of the value of the coin that allow us to use it as a shared currency. If I just talk about the face of the coin and you talk about the back of the coin, and we're trying to, we're getting nowhere because we're not even recognizing that the coin is there, right? We're having two separate conversations. And what I really think is so critical in this is that you look at our politicians, you hear a lot of news media, you hear a lot of cable news, you hear a lot of pundits' opinions. We're as divided as we ever have been. And where that gets reflected is in our governing bodies. It used to be a time as divided as we've always been since parties started to exist back in the early 1800s. Our politicians, to your point, there's a lot of posturing and a lot of public stuff, but behind closed doors, they're engaging, they're compromising, they're negotiating, they're coming up with different ways. We've now shifted to this, it's my way or the highway mentality, so much so that that's how our politicians are governing. They're not talking to each other behind closed doors. They actually don't like each other behind closed doors because we're voting in people who perpetuate that governing process. Then we get mad that nothing is happening, right? Or we get mad that too much of one side is getting their way and not enough of the other side is getting introduced. So then we just go into this majority-minority flip, right? Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And we're not actually moving in a common direction while we are still going to disagree on things. We are still going to have different ideas. We are still going to want things a different way, but we can at least come to a place where we can agree on the decisions going forward that have a benefit to both of us. Now, I also recognize, philosophically, this isn't some panacea of worldview. This isn't going to be something where we're all kumbaya-ing, coming up with everything. We're still going to have anger. We're still going to have resistance. We're still going to have frustrations. But we're also going to have tools to navigate those things more productively when they occur. So rather than living in it constantly, we navigate through it, back into it, through it, back into it. And we ride this wave of experience with each other rather than living in two different worlds. Because right now we are, in essence, living in two different worlds and we're just all pissed off. I'm not pissed off, but the collective of the human experience, right? I'm wearing a cat Christmas sweater. I'm not pissed off.
True. It's you kind of can't be with the cat collage sweater.
Yeah, I can't. You just can't be mad. I can't be mad. I might not even be looking at it, but I can't be mad wearing it. It's just not. I should take it off if I'm mad.
Well, I definitely think that this is helpful for folks who are reassessing how to go about this new world that we're living in. Obviously, no one knows what's coming exactly, but we do know that it could be better. I think we all could agree that our political world, our conversations, the divisiveness isn't helping us in the long run. This is the More in Common podcast. We are going to get out of here because we're almost out of time.
We're not even going to take a break today.
No, it just flew by.
It just flew by. And look, I love having these conversations. Appreciate you tuning in, as we always say.
Yeah,
give us a like, give us a follow. We're going to hope you share it. Share the episode. Ask yourself the question, why do I like talking about politics with other people? And try to have an honest answer with yourself so that you can use that answer. It's like last week, we talked about setting values to navigate shame, right? Understand this so you can understand how you want to navigate those conversations. Going back to Gerren's point, like, you're going to fail. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to work every time. That's okay. That's okay. We're telling you it's okay. I hope you think it's okay. You're not here right now, so I just hope it's okay. Yeah. And if that's the case, hey, give us a like, give us a follow, subscribe. And if you want to know more about all the things that More in Common does, you can go to More in Common, ENT, as in enterprises, not entertainment.com. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, y'all. Peace out.
Deuces.